So, what is all this ECG and PPG and PWTT stuff anyway? And why do we care? Well, we're going to explain that in this little section. And if you're watching it, it means you just watched a video about an ECG PPG sensor fitness band or watch. Because I'm going to tack this section at the end of every single one of those, since it's new technology and I know you guys aren't watching all of them. If you've seen this segment before, you can bail out of the video because it's a repeat. If you haven't seen it, you might want to listen to understand about the band or watch you're considering purchasing. I'm going to read through it with you. First of all, take a look at these pictures. You know, in the medical community, they can hook you up to a biomedical device that creates this whole heart wave chart labeled with A, B, C, D, E, and all these different areas and heights and things that the medical folks know how to read. It's a medical equipment device and is relatively expensive, although you can probably rent them for the time you need them if you have issues related to your heart. You have electrodes that go on your body, and they pick up a signal that gets recorded through the electronics in the device. Well, the electric monitor is a bioelectricity that's generated from each of the heart sections beating by a pacemaker, atrium, and ventricular. Yes, ECG data is calculated from the changes of it. You're going to find that this is kind of Chinese English as we read it as well. So I hope we can both figure out what they're actually saying because the sentence structure isn't perfect. What they're looking at is taking this concept and shoving it into this device on your wrist with 3 electrodes. 2 are usually on the bottom, and the third one is something that you touch on the side without letting your left and right arms make contact, okay, so that the signal that's being picked up by those electrodes will come from or pass through your heart from the bottom electrodes and separately from the top electrodes down both arms. According to the principle of medical testings, you put a finger on the electrode plate of, in this case it's the T6, one of the watch bands we're reviewing, but any of them that are designed this way, while wear on wrist to produce bioelectricity through the body's circulation to detect the data generated. The goal is to get a relative chart similar to this one that comes from this. Now we're going to find out why you need that. First, we have to do some definitions. The definition of ECG is electrocardiography. And there's ECG sensors that measure the biopotential generated by electric signals that control the expansion and contraction of the heart chambers. PPG is what we're used to seeing for getting your heart rate on smartwatches and smart bands. PPG, here we go, is plethysmography. Photoplethysmography.
Photoplethysmography. Photoplethysmography.
Sensors. Don't do that with a mouthful of jelly beans. These use a light-based technology to sense the rate of blood flow as controlled by the heart's pumping action. Those are the little green lights you see on the bottom of your watch. And that's what we've typically used to come up with your heart rate, your pulse. And I guess in the sort of newer technology, it's been used to create your analysis of your blood pressure and your blood oxygen. But we'll continue on that one because we still haven't been able to fully test the accuracy of the PPG by itself. What's really cool and what's new with these devices is the blend, the combination of the ECG and the PPG for a PWTT that lets you come up with a better accuracy of all of your biometrics. Okay, comparative questions. Let's run through these. It tells you the difference between the two so you can better understand them. How is heart activity measured? ECG sensors directly use electric signals produced by the heart activity, while PPG sensors use electrical signals derived from light reflected due to the changes in blood flow during heart activity. I kind of got that from the definitions, right? Well, which is most accurate? ECG is a reference standard signal that is used for monitoring cardio health and wellness by healthcare providers. PPG sensors, on the other hand, typically use ECG signals as a reference for static heart rate comparison. Kind of saying that ECG is sort of the standard that is used by healthcare providers, and the optical method is measured against the static for comparison to see how accurate they are. Hint, ECG sounds like it's more accurate. Can heart rate, HR, be measured? Heart rate is the same as pulse. With ECG, HR can be measured accurately. HR can be measured with PPG, however, it is only suitable for average or moving average measurements. That's why it's kind of difficult to tell when you're getting your heart rate on your current watch if it's real or not. It's an average. So if you're sprinting and checking your heart rate at the end of the sprint, it may be reading lower than it actually is because it's doing an average, or what's called a moving average, which means throwing away the oldest data and, say, taking the last 5 or 10 measurements and averaging all of those as it moves forward in time. That's the moving average. Okay, can heart rate variability, oh my gosh, here's another term. What in the world is that? Can it be measured? HRV can be readily derived from ECG data, as our peak intervals can be extracted. Wake up! HRV, come on, hang in there. Can be heart rate variability is the how much variance there is between heart rates. Let's say you're at 60 beats per minute. Well, what if you got 60, 63, 58, 60? That's the heart rate variability. Correct me if I'm wrong, any medical providers. I'm not a doctor. I don't pretend to really know this stuff. I'm just working my way through it like the rest of us here. Heart rate variability, can you measure that? And apparently a measure of the heart rate variability gives you an indicator of your level of stress. If you're calm, if you're zenning, if you're doing mindfulness, it should be regular. Okay, your HRV should be regular. If it's static and changing, it could mean you're under stress. So that's the watches and devices that tell you your stress level. That's probably what they're attempting to give you, is the HRV, which apparently is really hard from the PPG because that's a moving or static average, right? And doesn't really take into account the variability. We move on. HRV can be readily derived, however, from the ECG data, as our peak intervals can be extracted with millisecond accuracy. Our peak, I think, is that little beep, beep, you know, the little sound you see in the TV shows before you go flatline, right? Beep, the little beep, beep, that's the R peak. And you can measure that with millisecond accuracy, which means you can really tell the time difference between those peaks, right? So that meaningful HRV data can be obtained with short duration measurements, usually like 30 seconds or so, which is typically what you get in the chart that comes from the transmission of this data from your device to your app in your in your phone, that you could extract and send out to your healthcare provider. With PPG sensors, peak interval accuracy is limited by usable sampling rate due to the high power consumption of the LEDs. With PPG, pulse rate variation correlates with HRV, all right? With PPG, this is the light diode kind of thing, PRV, pulse rate variation, correlates with the heart rate variation for longer periods of measurement, over 5 minutes, but not for short duration measurements because it's doing a moving average. Only if the moving average starts to change dramatically, which you can only get over a long period of time. In a sense, you're looking at the average of the averages, or the standard deviation from the average of the averages. will you find that you have stress or not by trying to use the PPG diode technology to get pulse rate variation. That's too long to go, by goodness. By then, if you sat for 5 minutes, you would have calmed yourself down. You wouldn't need this. Maybe that's what they're trying to get you to do. Breathe. How long does it take to take a reading? Well, ECG sensors don't require long settling times. I mean, you hook it up and it goes, right? Stat clear! So, meaningful readings can be obtained very shortly after startup. PPG sensors require a relatively long setting time due to the need for, you ready? Measuring the amount of ambient light and calculating the compensation needed for canceling its effect. Are you taking your pulse in the dark, in the sunlight? Are you moving? Are you moving in and out of shadow? And all that ambient light has to be added or subtracted correctly to the tiny variation that the light diodes are getting back from in the sensors that represents the blood movement through your capillaries. It's really tricky. And they got big old algorithms to try to cancel out the effects of ambient light. But nonetheless, it can't really start giving you a good measurement, which is why you don't see it right away on your watch, until it's measured the ambient light and compensated for it. Whereas the ECG, boom, it's right there. PPG sensors may also require compensation of motion artifacts to produce a reading. Come on, common sense. If you want the thing to work, you're going to have to hold really, really still when you have the optical sensor reading your pulse. If you move a little bit, your capillaries are moving underneath, and it's just going to throw everything off. You found that out. And that's why oftentimes we think that these things are not accurate. Well, they're partially accurate as we're learning, and they're not accurate because you're not standing still and your ambient light is changing. Fix those conditions, and your current watch will be more accurate. There, you learned something, making it worthwhile watching this whole silly thing, right? All right, wait, there's more. Here we go. Which has the lowest power consumption? We need to know that for these darn low battery watches and bands, right? NeuroSky's BDM 101 ECG sensor features extremely low power consumption, operating at 2.5 milliwatts. Most PPG sensors require approximately 30 milliwatts of operating power. Well, as you know, that's really not all that much, either of those, in comparison to cellular radio or GPS. So you're not like really draining your battery unless you have it on continuously monitoring your heart rate, probably with either sensors, but for sure with the optical. Which is the smallest footprint? Well, the BDM 101 ECG, you think this is a sales sheet for the BDM 101? Probably is. It's the world's smallest ECG sensor at only 3 millimeter by 3 millimeter with no additional components required. PPG sensors featured a relatively large PCB footprint. That's not the PCBs that are toxic. I have no idea what it is, but I don't. Hopefully it's not. Oh my gosh, if we're running around with PCBs on our wrist. It's a big package, typically 6 by 6, which is like 9 times bigger, right? Or 4 times bigger. Plus additional PCB area for the microcontroller unit, battery management crystal, LED circuits, and don't forget the little wire that, has to hook it all up. A lot of stuff going in there. It's a big footprint. In a small package, it takes up more space. What they're not mentioning, though, is remember, you got to have electrodes, and so it doesn't take up a lot of space, but there's 2 plates on the bottom and 1 on the side or the front that have to be touched. So that's all part of the ECG circuit. But the little goodie itself that figures it all out is a tiny little thing on the ECGs. Is any external equipment required to produce a reading? Well, on this fancy BMD101 sensor features on-chip HR measurements, so no external equipment is required. In contrast, the PPG sensor does require external microcontroller unit for HR calculation. This is all in one. This one has the little separate diode thing, and that's why you got that cable inside. If you take your watch back off, that hooks it into the main circuit board because it's got to hook up to a chip to read and understand what that optical sensor is picking up. How easy is it to integrate with a device? The BDM 101 ECG sensor features an SDK, Android, iOS for easy app development and integration, which is, folks, why we're now able to get this stuff on these smart devices. So far, it's in bands. As you know, if you're watching this video, you just probably saw a review on a fitness band that has ECG capability, but it's going to come to watches, you mark my words. By 2018, we're going to start seeing ECG, PPG integration on watches as well. Why not? It's small. It's just a matter of isolating the case and putting electrodes on the back and someplace to touch on the watch to get the electrical hookup. The sensor features an SDK, which is sort of like an APK. After you put the SDK in the APK, you got an app that you can use, right, for easy app development and integration. PPG sensors require an MCU firmware up development and integration in addition to host platform app development and integration, which is why we've seen a lot of the different watches, more or less accurate or not, around the optical sensor stuff, because the sensor unit itself is just spitting out the data. It's all up to the MCU firmware that interprets all of that stuff to give you accurate or not so accurate heart rate or pulse data. Okay? I guess we should be saying pulse data when you're talking about optical and heart rate data when you're talking about electrical. Get the terminology right. When it comes to key considerations like size, power consumption, accuracy, ease of integration, and richness of data, ECG biosensors present a clear advantage over their PPG counterparts for heart rate monitoring. But it's just now hitting the market in our tiny little watches and bands. ECG biosensors are capable of delivering the widest range of heart health metrics because they are able to capture more comprehensive signals of overall heart performance, including both heart rate and heart rate variability. Now, up until now, all of this, we are talking about your pulse rate, your heart rate, nothing yet about blood pressure or blood oxygen, two other measurements that the medical community uses and fitness zealots use to understand their body dynamics. Let's move on. That brings us to pulse wave transit time, PWTT, and its relationship with systolic blood pressure. How do you take the stuff that we're getting from the heart wave and the biometric optical sensor, all right, the ECG signal and the PPG signal? How do you mess around with that in order to come up with blood pressure in relationship to your actual systolic blood pressure to get accurate readings? Well, this paper talks about all of that. And I'm going to put it on the screen and let you read it. Maybe we'll jump into a little bit of it, but and I'll also have the reference to it in the show notes down below. And hopefully you can just freeze your screen right now and read this. I'll give you some overall, well, let's look at the abstract to get the premise of where it's coming from. It says that blood pressure is one important parameter in assessing a patient's or your own health status and fitness and so forth. The measurement of blood pressure using conventional method is less practical in monitoring continuous blood pressure. This paper proposes an automatic technique for monitoring blood pressure continuously using the relation of the pulse wave transit time with the systolic blood pressure. The measurement of PWTT involves the marking of electrocardiograph R, the ECG R peak, from electrocardiograph signal, and the peak of peripheral pulse wave from the PPG signal. Okay? That's the optical and the electrical. Data collection involves 3 different sessions, which are resting period, exercise period, and recovery period, thus establishing the relationship between SBP and PWTT. The results of monitoring blood pressure based on pulse wave transit time will facilitate personal healthcare monitoring blood pressure continuously. And that's why I do deep breathing exercises. Okay, introduction gives you some of the background, basically what the PWTT really is. And then we come back up here to column 2, and it continues with that chart. And you can kind of see that what they're doing is measuring the time. This is against time, the time between the peak that is seen on the ECG and the bump that you see on the optical PPG. This is your systolic. You hear my roosters? Love it. This is the optical bump that is used to compute your pulse rate with the optical sensor. And this is the really fine, detailed microsecond accuracy of the ECG. Getting both those signals coming in out of your body at once and analyze can let them compute your PWTT. And this whole paper is based on using that PWTT with your systolic blood pressure to get biometric data that's more accurate for you and your body. So it goes through in this particular paper and talks about setting up an experiment or two. And now we get really technical. So we'll just let this parse itself on the screen. Shows you a pulse circuit. This is the philosophy and technique behind doing this whole thing. And obviously, they've managed to miniaturize all of this electronics down to where it now fits in these little fitness bands. Okay, and then they go on to do a second experiment. And this is just the first 2 pages of the whole article, because you got to buy the whole article. This is what they give you for free. You'll see the link down below. If you're really interested in this, you can dive further. So we've moved on from ECG and PPG measurements to determine the pulse wave transit time. From that, and using specialized circuitry, we can analyze the signal difference to get the PWTT and work with it. So we're talking about an electroplate type blood pressure bracelet that's based on the principle of PWTT to measure blood pressure. You got the blood pressure reading, the ECG test plus PPG, and heart rate. Those are kind of the 3 things that are going on now in this new family of devices. The PWTT principle, trying again to talk about it in so many different ways it makes sense. Pulse wave transmission speed and blood pressure is directly related to high blood pressure. Pulse transmission fast, otherwise slow. I love Chinese English. Through the ECG signal and the pulse wave signal, PPG can be obtained. Pulse wave transmission speed, PWTT, plus wave transmission time. It's actually pulse wave. I'm not going to let the Chinese errors slip through, but their own unique languaging is okay. We can figure it out. Anyway, the pulse, the ECG and the PPG signaling can get you the PWTT, and then from that calculate the blood pressure value. So once again, this is the ECG signal that you see, and a certain point in time can be registered when it finds that peak. This is the optical thing coming through, and at a certain time it can determine that bump in your capillary response back to the sensor, and it can measure the time difference between these two on your arm. With that time difference, it can then go and calculate your blood pressure. When testing the ECG, the right hand on the metal body on the bracelet, do not touch the left arm like that, okay? You can't rest your finger against it. You can't rest your thumb. That's why most of them have a button on the front. See, here's the electrodes on the back and the other electrodes on the side that you squeeze. Some of them have it on the front, much easier, but some have it on the side. Either way could work, as long as it bridges your heart. The 2 electrodes at the bottom of the hand ring are in full contact with the left hand. The 3 parts will form an electric circuit, and combined with The green photoelectric sensor test result calculate the blood pressure data. All right, we're almost done. One more document I wanted to go through. Oh gosh, yeah, it's long, but it really lays the total foundation for this. So if you're in school, especially if you're studying medical or health, you might want to write a theme paper on this. I think you could get an A. Mr. Tix will help you with this. I'm not going to answer a lot of questions. I don't know much more than what I'm showing you, but I mean, this is good stuff. You guys should seriously think about writing a dissertation. Well, at least a homework paper. The emergence of mobile technology advances in these biosensors are promising to change the conventional healthcare system to facilitate systems that provide for mobile and individual-centered healthcare systems. Mobile monitoring systems can provide continuous physiological data and better information regarding the general health of individuals. I love good English. For example, such a mobile cardiac health monitoring system can reduce healthcare costs by disease prevention and enhancement of the quality of life with disease management, i.e., this could be a health preventative device that can be used in wellness by monitoring correctly your bio data and especially being able to get the ECG information, the actual chart, and send that off to your healthcare provider if you have some form of an incident that needs monitoring but happens so quickly they don't have time to hook you up at the doctor's office or get you into the hospital. Something like this might give you that preliminary data that could find something way more than this PWTT thing. I mean, when you look at all of the jiggles on that, they all mean something, and doctors and medical folks know what that is. Cardiologists, valuable. So if it's reliable and if it's accurate, which it's professing that it is because it's actually giving you that electrical hookup directly to your heart, then that data may be really, really valuable. So even if you don't use it for blood pressure and heart rate, the fact that you've got ECG output in the form of a chart that can be made into a PDF that can be emailed is amazing. Accordingly, a mobile device is disclosed that determines the user's cardiac health status by monitoring multiple key cardiovascular parameters and or their index, such as ECG, heart rate, cardiac output, and blood pressure, in a continuous and non-invasive fashion. For example, users can conveniently carry currently handheld mobile devices anywhere and conduct self-monitoring when desired or necessary, all the time or as needed when convenient. And that's what these medical devices often do that you see, stuck on a belt or something like that. They'll measure you 24/7 for 3 weeks, and then they dump all that data at the doctor's office and work with it. We're talking about a little wrist kind of thing that can either give you spontaneous instant measurements over 30 seconds to 2 minutes or actually be able to do continuous measurement. It's storing that data that's the difficult thing. It can certainly generate it, but anyway, we digress. The home fitness bands are going to just basically give you your ECG, heart rate, and blood pressure information. All right, I'm not going to read any more. Let's just let you skim this whole document because it's giving you kind of a background pep talk about why this is good, okay? But we will get in here and says it is commonly accepted that the pulse wave transmit time can be registered as an index of arterial stiffness and has been employed as an indirect estimation of blood pressure. PWTT can be measured at the time as the time interval between the R wave peak of ECG and the pulse wave arrival in the same cardiac cycle. When ECG and pulse wave are simultaneously recorded, that can be derived. PWTT was originally applied to the area blood pressure estimation, and here's a reference for all that. And since then, the researchers have studied the mechanism of the method and on and on. So now you're getting the background that has led up to the science of being able to do this with cuffless blood pressure estimation based on PTTT, pulse transit time techniques, right? It's actually pulse wave, PWTT, so forth and so on. Okay, so bottom line, What we are looking at in these new devices that Mr. Tix is all excited to be bringing you, a bunch of different bands, a bunch of different watches, as this new technology emerges and becomes the de facto standard for, say, 2018 to 2019 in wearable devices. What we're looking at is the science behind how that works and why it is presumed, estimated, anticipated, and hoped to be relatively accurate and usable for collecting biometric data for your fitness and overall health. All right? Thanks for watching this. Really, if you stuck with it the whole way, I applaud you. Hopefully you can use it somehow in your life, and it'll be valuable to you. In the meantime, you now know what we're talking about when you see something that says it's got ECG plus PPG. If you want some more background information on this, there is a lot out there. I don't know if you've ever done this before. Instead of just going to Google and typing in Google, if you start your search with scholar.google.com, you get into a whole different Google search. And you can go in and put in, for example, ECG plus PPG, which is the technology behind this watch. Now, in the other video, I showed you a lot of information, actual reports on how this technology works together. When you put in just ECG plus PPG in the Scholar Google thing, this is what you get on just the first page. And there's several, like 19,000 pages of stuff related to the concept of ECG plus PPG. If you add to that search term HRV, which is heart rate variability, that's the difference between the heartbeats, remember, that kind of is a gauge of your stress level and your heart coherence and heart math and all those concepts, you'll come up with more reports that talk about heart rate variability as assessed between ECG and PPG technology. So Google that in the Google Scholar as well. And then finally, an invitation while you're in Google Scholar to put in the term PWTT, because that's the technology that's being used to compute your blood pressure from these two measurement techniques. You can learn about pulse wave transit time through these different documents here. So you ask about accuracy and whether this stuff has got some background and science to it. Here it all is. It's right at your fingertips. All you got to do is put in scholar.google.com and put in your search terms and you'll find it. All right.